Afghanistan might seem like a faraway place, but it's not really, because we are connected here around the world. We have connections, especially with what's going on at the present time. The scenes in Kabul are heart-wrenching, and they're replicated in other parts of the country as well. And in Scotland, we have direct connection to Afghanistan through the fellowship programme, and trying to help and support, which is what the Scottish Government has been doing, supporting the fellowship and the people who are part of that. So glad that people have been able to get out, although that's double-edged, isn't it? Because we would obviously wish people to be able to continue living in Afghanistan, contributing to civil society, and making Afghanistan the kind of place that most people in Afghanistan would want it to be. So we have to listen, and we have to learn to what people from Afghanistan are saying. In the Scottish Government, we are keen to help and be as supportive as we can with those who are coming seeking refuge, and we will be as supportive throughout the country as we possibly can be. And just as a last thought, we'd really like to thank Beyond Borders and everybody who has been involved with the fellowship, and we look forward to working over the future years and see it go from strength to strength.
So welcome back. It's great to see so many people here. It's fantastic to be back meeting in person. We've all missed this desperately. My name is Allan Little. I'll introduce you to the three people on the platform with me shortly. But first of all, we want to hear from Ogai Wardack, who has just got out of Afghanistan. Ogai, welcome. It's great to see you. You're a TV journalist working for Zan TV. What was the atmosphere like for you as it became clear that Kabul was in imminent danger of falling to the Taliban? What did it do to you?
Thank you so much for everyone that they are here, dear excellencies, guests, and all people that hear me. I'm Ogai Wardack. I'm from Afghanistan, Kabul, Afghanistan. I work with different media stations, and at the last I work with Zan TV, the TV that we work for women in Afghanistan, for women rights in Afghanistan. And now we are out of country because of the last bad accident that we faced, and the arrival of Taliban was a bad dream for all Afghan people and all the world. And we lose lots of things. We lose our dreams, we lose our aims, we lose our work, study, and our country. And now I'm out of Afghanistan, and I can mention my feelings that I'm too much sad for myself, for my family, for my society, for my country, that now and today we face with these problems, we face with this situation that we have in Afghanistan. Maybe it's the second week that Taliban control all the Afghanistan, and nobody is there because Afghanistan lose the resources, Afghanistan lose their educated people, like especially journalists, engineers, doctors. They all left Afghanistan because of situation and security, because we were not comfortable with Taliban government, and we didn't have security in Taliban government because we have an experience from the 20 years ago. The Taliban view was bad for all Afghanistan people, especially for us, that our mother, grandmas, that our last people tell us story of the Taliban. The Taliban was too much bad. Taliban were bad phases, and Taliban beat people, especially women, and Taliban have problems with women working. And when again for the second time Taliban came to Afghanistan, again we face with this story, and in fact it's the reality of Taliban. The Taliban didn't want the women working in Afghanistan. I spent 5 days, the last 5 days that I were in Afghanistan with Taliban controlling the Afghanistan. Believe me, the last 5 days were too much bad experience of my life, that I was in Afghanistan. I can't go out of home. I can't go to my work, my university. because we don't have security. So because of that, I must be compelled to leave Afghanistan for my safety, for my work, and for my life.
Let me ask you, Ogai, were you forced to hide from the Taliban? And how did you manage to get out? Were you part of those terrible scenes that we've seen at Kabul airport?
Yeah, at the last 5 years that I work in different social media, different media, and in society, like I had a lot of interviews with the international medias that I said that if Taliban came, I will fight. If Taliban came, I will continue my work. If Taliban came, I will raise the woman hands. And it was a big treat for me. And today I know that my cousins was also Talib, because sometimes he told me that if Taliban kill, we will kill you. So I think it was a joke from him. I think that he will not Talib. But today my mother told me that your cousins as well with Taliban, and your cousins is Talib. So I faced with high risk in Afghanistan, and also when Taliban came to Afghanistan, they killed more than 10 journalists in different provinces, especially in Kabul. They killed them because of some situations that they say to women that don't come to your office, and where is your ID card, who you are, and where is your home. And they start the woman journalists like searching house by house, and they start the searching for the woman journalist house by house. And the point is that world and international community are watching them, and they can do something. They can harm people because of like international community helps or international community support. But I'm sure that Taliban are not changed. Taliban are like the same that we had in the past 20 years ago. So if I see the Taliban, if I see the Taliban managing, when I see the Taliban controlling, so I decide to leave the Afghanistan, and then I contact two border reporters that I can't live more in Afghanistan because I face with lots of challenge, and I face with high risk because they are coming to my home and they are searching me.
Okay.
So thank you so much from the borders and also CPG that now we are safe in Qatar.
Let me ask you, Ogai, you must have had mixed feelings as you flew away, because it would have been a relief to be safe, but at the same time, you're leaving your homeland and facing a future in exile. I understand you've got a ticket to Ireland tomorrow. You're going to go and live in Ireland. What do you think about that?
That at the first I said that I can mention my feelings. I have a kindergarten in Afghanistan for more than 80 children that I teach them. I have a like non-profit organization in Afghanistan for women rights. I have my own office like Zan TV that I work with them for my women. So I leave everything in Afghanistan, and I left them and I stopped them because I know that after this time I can't work in the Afghanistan. So I decided to leave Afghanistan and I work from another country for my country. About Irish, I don't know that from where and from I will start again. I don't know. It's too much difficult for me that again I will start my work, I will start my study. But I have hope. I have support, my family support, international community support. So Irish is good government. I heard about Irish that Irish Ireland have too much good cricket team. So I know Irish from her cricket team. Then I searched about Irish that Ireland is too much good country, and it's good country for living and for study. So we'll see what will happen, inshallah. But I have hope and I have wish. I know that the Irish government will too much support me, and I have support of them. So I will start my work from Irish, and I will start for work for myself, for my country, and for all the world.
Okay. Ogai, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We wish you all the best. Everybody in the room here is on your side, and we hope we will see you one day in Scotland as well as Ireland. Good luck and solidarity. Solidarity from us. Samina, it's a powerful thing to listen to, isn't it? You must, part of you must, Samina Ansari, I beg your pardon, I'll introduce you to, is also from Afghanistan, although grew up mostly in Norway, but has been living in Afghanistan for the last 6 years, and you left only earlier this year. What's it like listening to Ogai?
It's devastating because you see that the people of Afghanistan don't even have the time to process what has happened to their country. In the last couple of weeks, I've talked to people, mainly in Europe, and a lot of the people I speak with tell me that they're paralyzed because of what they're watching in their screens and the news that they're reading. But Afghans don't have the time to be paralyzed right now. And people like Ogai, there's thousands of young people like that. And when the incident in Kabul happened, they had to be quick in evacuating their families, their colleagues. They had to move from their houses. They had to go in hiding. They had to figure out a way to leave for those that felt that their lives were in danger. At the same time, I was sitting in Oslo and I felt incredibly guilty for being one of those that could sit on a plane and leave. Given I had spent 6 years living in Afghanistan and I had met so many of these young voices that all of a sudden disappeared from the global media because they were afraid. And there is a lot of fear associated with the Taliban, and I think like what Olga is saying, because of the uncertainty, we don't really know who they are. A lot of Afghans grew up with the Taliban basically being the ghost under the bed and the ghost in the closet. We don't trust them.
So one of the things you were doing in Afghanistan until recently was teaching. What will be the dilemma faced by many of the people you were teaching who were looking forward to this future that had been promised them by the international involvement in Afghanistan? What will they be doing now?
I mean, I think in order to give a full picture of what Afghanistan was like the last 20 years, I moved back in 2015, and I was incredibly surprised because I had only known Afghanistan as a miserablest subject, only war and trauma and horrible stories coming in. But in 2015, when I moved to Kabul, I met young people that were a part of a value chain, building their nation, carrying the values of the entire country on their shoulders. And that also included a lot of young Afghans taking higher education. We have more educated Afghans in the history of Afghanistan right now today. And the university that I was teaching in, a lot of young girls that had great ambitions of becoming leaders, of fighting for their entire nation and not just for their own rights. And some of these young students have messaged me the last couple of days saying that they have been burning their diplomas. They're cutting all contact with the universities that they have been associated with in the country just because they don't know what that would mean to them and what that would mean for their families. And that's devastating because we spent 20 years building platform for these young people to be able to use the potential that they had gained and for them to remove all that they had gained. That is a loss, regardless of what kind of government we will have in the future.
So it's communicated to us that those who worked with the occupying forces have to get out for their own safety. But in fact, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have to disguise what they did in the last 20 years.
Absolutely. And there's stories from people telling me that Taliban are going door to door, asking them whether they have worked for the government or been associated with an international NGO, international organization. And that is literally the entire population in Afghanistan because we've had NGOs present in the country for the last 20 years. Taliban seem to be incredibly intrigued by cell phones. So even, leaving your home and going to the airport, they check your phones and they see who you have been communicating with. And this creates terror. It creates a fear where you feel like Now they know me. They have marked me. And also the road to the airport is life-threatening. But I must say that the friends that we have been trying to evacuate the last couple of weeks, even after the attack, the horrible, horrible terrorist attack that was at the airport, many of them came back the day after. And I think it shows the desperation of people coming back to a place where they could potentially die, but they try anyways, because they want out from this uncertain situation.
And we have international eyes and ears in Kabul. There are reporters there, there are still diplomats there. But we have no idea really what's going on in Herat, in Mazar, where you're from, or Kandahar, or the countryside, do we? Will we ever find out what's really going on across the country?
I hope so. But I think it's really disappointing to see that the first groups leaving are the diplomats. We need diplomats in Afghanistan right now more than ever. And we also need the international community that has been involved in Afghanistan and journalists that have been involved in Afghanistan to do exactly this, Allan, to give us information about how are the Taliban in provinces, because Taliban have been governing in provinces much longer than in Kabul. And just before Kabul collapsed, the research organization that I've been involved in Afghanistan, they sent me some data from the women in these areas. And what this research was showing was that the majority of the women feel like their life quality has decreased since Taliban came to power. But then their voices were silenced after the Kabul collapse. So I truly hope we can hear from those people, because we need to know what's happening in the rest of the country in order to understand who Taliban are today.
Well, my fear as a journalist who's worked in Afghanistan is that even if the Taliban grant access to foreign reporters to other parts of the country, the people will be too afraid to speak to us, and that's devastating, really. Let me introduce you to Eldridge Adolfo, a Swedish diplomat, as you've heard. Eldridge, you were advisor to the EU Special Envoy to Afghanistan. Were you surprised by how quickly it all fell apart?
Yes, thank you, Allan. And yes, I think we all knew there was going to be a change. Just the dramatic changes in the last days of this, that caught us all by surprise.
Why could it not have been more phased? Why could it not? Why did the Americans have to pick this arbitrary date and say we'll be out by then, instead of taking several months to get everybody who needed to get out in an orderly fashion? It seems reckless.
Oh, I think it's completely reckless in the way it's been handled. I think there was, again, Allan, Biden had said he'd get out by the 11th of September. So we had a bit of time to have an orderly transition, yeah. And I'm not pretending that it would have been nice at the end, that everything would have gone smoothly or it would be perfect. No, of course it was going to be a mess. There's no question about it. But it still could have been mitigated to an extent that it wasn't what it has turned out to be now. And I have no understanding why it had to happen by the 4th of July. It was already the date of the 11th of September.
What sort of negotiations took place up to the fall of Kabul, and who's talking to who now?
So in Doha, of course, the negotiations were between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is a whole team, 21 people, and it was the Taliban Political Commission, right? And it was direct talks, if you like, and of course Qatar and the UN and the US wanted to play a facilitated role, but it really was direct talks. The difficulty with those talks is that they didn't actually move. Now, we had a role in terms of having an inclusive peace process. And just quickly, just so people, it's not just a word out there, an inclusive peace process really was about trying to get society to be involved in the negotiations, to actually have a voice, rather than just having an elite deal at the end of the day that wasn't going to serve them. So we were supporting an Afghan organization, a consortium of Afghan civil society organizations came together and created what they call the Afghan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, AMIP. And it was through them that we're trying to support this inclusive process. It's something we worked on with them for over 2 years or something. Samina was one of the founding people of that. In fact, Mark Muller as well, who has been instrumental in working with us in this year, has been one of the key advisors in how we've turned everything around. But using that, we were trying to get to the parties to actually consider the voice of the Afghan people. So all the people we're talking about, this woman, the young lady now, her ideas, what Samina is saying now, just, can I give an example just very quickly of, AMIP had a consultation with business women of Afghanistan. And this did not exist before 2001. And all of a sudden, when speaking to these women, in the last 10 years alone, they've managed to create 54,000 small and micro businesses. Admittedly, it's not corporations, but still, 54,000. And in turn, they've hired over hundreds of thousands of other women in these jobs. Now, a job, of course, it's a micro enterprise, they're not getting the most money, but a job is not just about money. It's also about empowerment, it's about prestige, it's about contributing to society, it's about being part of this here. And all of a sudden, that was going to crush. All that falls down if you don't have a process that actually says, can we be part of this? Can we keep our businesses going? Can we keep our livelihoods going? And this is what we're trying to get the message to the table. Now, we did get the message to the table. We get both the Islamic Republic and to the Taliban. And we have discussed these things with them at length and shared with them. But because the negotiations didn't actually get anywhere, that's all fallen out.
Well, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who sat around a table with the Taliban, what was the attitude of the Taliban throughout these talks? Because from the start, from 2001, they always said famously, you, the West, have the watches, but we have the time.
Yes.
We don't have to win this war. All we have to do is not lose it, because sooner or later you will get tired. Does that characterize the way they conducted themselves in the negotiations? They were simply waiting for the ripe fruit of Afghanistan to fall into their laps.
Well, I would also say they were aided and abetted by the US agreement, because if you have a clear date that we're going to leave on 11th of March and everything is withdrawing all our military, all our support, then of course that's easy to do that. Having said that, and we'll talk about now as well, I genuinely think that they genuinely want to have a stable sort of government in place. They want to take over a government that's stable. They don't want to have the mess that was there in 96 or 2001. So they're genuinely trying to create an inclusive government. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying for 1 second here that this inclusive government is going to be half as inclusive as we imagined. No, not at all. But I think that they do understand that they cannot go back to where they were. What they want to do with the state, I don't know.
What do they need anything at all from the West, or can they get everything they need from elsewhere, from Pakistan, from China especially? Does the West have any leverage over them at all?
Yes, of course. I mean, of course, once NATO pulls out, it takes away a huge bit of leverage there. But having said that, the Taliban definitely want to have international recognition. They don't want to be a pariah state. And that's one of the reasons you also see they refused to enter Kabul in the beginning, because they didn't want it to look like a military takeover. There were clear messages to them in Doha that if this is a military takeover, you will not be supported.
Well, they care about the optics. That's not the same thing as caring about the reality of the kind of government they're going to improve.
That's what I'm saying. What they will do with that, I don't know. But the optics of it is they'd like you to see that this is to appear to not be a military takeover, so that they can be recognized as a government and come into power. What they will do with that, it's very difficult to say, because in all the time we're speaking to them, they would not articulate the specifics of what they want. So I don't know what they will actually... And that was maybe the major challenge of the negotiations.
And is there any dialogue going on at the moment between Afghans, between the Taliban and the outside world?
My understanding is that there are some discussions on the ground. AMIP, this organization we were talking about, is being in contact with the parties right now. It had established good relationships with both of them, and so it's trying to continue right now, because it's in this period that they can help shape whatever comes through. And there are some discussions about how progressive they are or how substantive they are is still unclear.
Okay, let's ask Samina then what you make of that. Are you persuaded that there's scope for influencing the Taliban?
I mean, Allan, I think it's also important to highlight that Taliban were not the only issue in terms of this inclusive peace mechanism not being implemented. It was also the international community, because Afghans were not passive actors in the middle of everything that happened. They were incredibly active. March this year, I think 1,600 people, Eldridge, came together in Kabul. It was the largest civil society gathering in the history of Afghanistan. And they made clear demands. They said that they didn't want a hastily withdrawal. They wanted the alliances to actually withdraw in a responsible, structured way in installments. They wanted absolute ceasefire. But they were not heard not only by the Taliban, but also by the Americans that wounded the civil society with the deal that they made with the Americans, with the Taliban in February 2020. And then when it comes to the question of have Taliban been open to an inclusive society, so far not at all. I see pictures of the Cultural Commission that they have created in Kabul on Twitter. And it's only men, and they all look the same. And it doesn't really, it doesn't really represent the diversity of Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan, as you know, you've been there yourself, is one of the most diverse places in the world.
And when you hear President Biden say words to the effect of, we couldn't stay indefinitely, we couldn't stay forever, the Afghan army massively outnumbered the Taliban. They had more sophisticated weapons. And if, as he put it, if Afghans aren't prepared to fight for themselves, they can't expect America to stay indefinitely to fight for them. What do you make of that?
I mean, Afghans fought for 20 years. We lost 66,000 troops. And at some point, NATO had 130,000 soldiers on the ground. They didn't defeat the Taliban. So I think to minimize the Afghan support to just the last couple of weeks is a disgrace.
William Dalrymple, of course, needs no introduction here. William, your book, The Return of the King, is, to my astonishment, 10 years old now. It seems very recent to me, but it's that old. Do you see historical parallels with what's happening today?
Well, maybe just before going into the history, just to say how furious we all should be in this room at what's happened. It's completely unnecessary. The tragedy that Ogai was talking of, what we see in our screens, was completely avoidable. There was almost no foreign troops on the ground for the last 5-6 years. There were contractors, supervisors, air support, political suppliers, and this sort of stuff. But it was not like Vietnam, where America was bleeding tens of thousands of lives every day. It was a completely stationary situation, with the Taliban slowly encroaching in the rural areas, but still sustainable, and with the Afghans government controlling all the cities, all the populated areas, and quite a lot of the countryside in the day, and losing it at night. That could have been sustained more or less indefinitely, with fewer troops than America has currently in South Korea or Italy. And the way that Biden pulled the rug, and I mean, I don't know how many of you read about what happened at Bagram, where the Americans didn't even tell the Afghan military they were pulling out. And the first the Afghans learned of it was when the Americans literally turned the lights off. And all the locals then ran in and started helping themselves to tables and chairs, whatever was lying around in the Coke dispensers and all the stuff in the base. And by the time the Afghan military arrived at 6 a.m, the place was a mess. But I mean, this one astonishing thing, just to give you an idea, they left, I think, 8,000 vehicles in that base, but took the keys. What message is that meant to give to a military? And more importantly, the way that the American military has organized itself in the last 10 years, a lot has been based on contractors. So that as part of this sort of right-wing privatization of war, you have soldiers, but a lot of it is done by non-military suppliers who look after these very sophisticated weapon systems. And when they withdrew the contractors, most of the weapons simply were not serviceable. So it's like leaving a bunch of grandparents at home with a really complicated telly with Netflix and all the stuff, and no one knows how to operate the remote. You know that situation. and so although technically they had these weapons, anything larger and more operational than a machine gun was simply not working. And this could have been avoided. It's all not about the reality of the ground, it's about the reality in American politics. And Biden needing to get out so as not to be outflanked by Trump and the Republicans, as he perceived it. And more terrifyingly still, Tim tells me that this is actually playing relatively okay in the States, that they're not outraged by what's happened. But we should be outraged. This morning, the Sunday Times reported that Raab our foreign minister, who's now more famous as a body surfer than as a man engaged in any sort of diplomatic activity, didn't fail to ring the Pakistani or the Afghan foreign minister in the last 6 months. I mean, this is outrageous. No, contingency plans to get the people that had helped our troops out over the last 20 years. Quite astonishing failures.
I'm going to press you again on the... Samina, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, and I'm really happy that you mentioned the responsibility of the international community as a whole, because the US had the blessing of the entire international community when they went into Afghanistan and when they decided to leave Afghanistan. So we shouldn't only be furious because of what Biden has done. We should be furious because of what we all have done.
Yep.
So, Willie, I'm going to have to press you on the history. I want to get on the history because
Okay.
it is really fascinating.
Okay, so just quickly, let me read you a passage here, and you can guess the date it's written. It was a war begun for no wise purpose, carried on with a strange mixture of rashness and timidity, brought to a close after suffering and disaster without much glory attached either to the government which had directed or the great body of troops which had waged it. Not one benefit, political or military, has been acquired by this war. Our eventual evacuation of the country resembled the retreat of an army defeated. Well, that was written in 1843 by the Reverend Gleig, who was the first historian of the first Anglo-Afghan war.
But the parallels are much closer than that.
Much closer than that would just exist. So the war was begun on the basis of doctored intelligence and a dodgy dossier by a group of ideologically driven hawks. In this case, the fear was not Islamism and myths of Islamic takeover of Europe and this sort of thing that was being peddled in 2001, but about Russian troops charging down the Khyber Pass. That was a single Russian envoy was spotted going into Afghanistan by a single East India Company operative who got lost. He reported this back, and this gave the credibility, rather like the yellow cake and all that stuff in the time of Blair and Powell going to the UN and talking about weapons of mass destruction in 2001. That gave credibility to a group of hawks who wanted to go in for their own reasons, which were partly commercial and partly they wanted to control the industry.
Say something about the Afghan players, though.
And then, astonishingly, the guy that the East India Company put in after a campaign which, like in 2001, got straight to Kabul almost without an obstacle and installed a government, was a man called Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who is the great-great-grandfather of Hamid Karzai, who we put in 2001. That government was eventually brought down by a whole spectrum of different players in Afghanistan, but the foot soldiers who led the resistance were the Ghilzai tribe, particularly the Hotaki Ghilzai tribe, of whom the current elder was Mullah Omar in 2001. So exactly the same, underneath what looks to us like a battle of sort of, Western liberal democracy against medieval barbarism, however you want to phrase it, is very familiar tribal fault lines, which are still in the country. The Ghilzai are basically the displaced, the dispossessed, the nomads from the south of the country, from Kandahar and so on. And the Duranis and the Popozais are the landlords, and the Pashtun upper classes, Persianized and urbanized.
This book gave you sort of uncannily close access to Karzai. Tell me that story.
So none of this was a secret, and the Taliban made much of this parallel because this was well known visible to the West, but very well known in Afghanistan. So one of the first Taliban press releases in 2001 was that everyone already knows that Karzai has been put on the throne of Shah Shuja, and then they put out messages in the villages saying, do you want to be remembered as the son of Dost Muhammad, who left the resistance, or do you want to be remembered as the son of Shah Shuja? In other words, do you want to be a patriot? And the bizarre thing is that the entire diplomatic district of Kabul is named after the main resistance leader, Wazir Akbar Khan. And so, in a sense, this is like the Battle of Britain. This is like, do you want to be remembered as who's the kind of our greatest fighter race defeating the Nazis? Not Bobber Harris, but whatever his Spitfire equivalent was. Or do you want to be remembered as a Quisling who worked for the Nazis? And so this is very emotive stuff.
But talk to me about the impact that book had on the ground. I mean, I don't know how much you want to say, but...
I'm very happy. No, it's all quite open stuff. So bizarrely, I got a message. I have a friend who runs, I don't know, many of you may have heard for the first time in the last 2 weeks about the Tolo News Network, which is this extraordinary independent TV station which has opened up and has incredible reportage by a lot of young reporters, a lot of the similar people to Ogai, who we just heard here. And this friend gave my book to Hamid Karzai, who read it on his way to Washington. And I started hearing messages that he hadn't been reading his briefing papers, but he's reading your book, ha, ha, ha. And then two weird things happened. First of all, I got called to Kabul by Karzai, and I got 6 nights with him alone after dinner. And we had a deal. Basically, I get to interview him for the New York Times. I did a long 8,000-word profile of him. In return, he would get to question me about the nitty-gritty and the detail of 1842 and 1840, how he could avoid the same fate as his forebears. And the message he took from the book was he had to publicly distance himself from the Americans and do everything he could do to be not seen as American quisling, to take the weapons, to take the aid, to help the help, but in public to denounce the Americans for bombing the wrong villages, to call them out for house searches and beating up women and all the things all the kind of missteps that the forces had taken. And I was obviously flattered by this, but didn't quite realize how high this had gone until WikiLeaks came out, and cables from Hillary Clinton were published on the front page of the New York Times saying, how can we stop Karzai reading this bloody book? Because the more he reads it, is there any other book we can give him which will tell a different side of the history?
Are you still in touch with him?
I got an email from him last week with a very, it was going to be nothing, very much sort of carry on up the Khyber British stiff upper lip. He was in the same Pashtun where he was saying, that things were a little tense, but they're stabilizing now.
So he's still there?
He's still there. He's in He and Abdullah both stayed behind, and an incredibly brave act, because obviously the last 2 or 3 Afghan presidents who've been around at a change of government had ended up castrated, hanging from lampposts, which is not something you'd wish on anyone. Yeah. So in a sense, much as we all curse and denounce Ashraf Ghani for running away, you can understand where that came from.
Yeah, I want to open it up to the floor now. We've got a roving microphone. If you've got a question or an observation you want to make, just raise your hand. Yes, there's a lady here in the pink.
This morning on Profile on Radio 4, they did a program on the leader of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And what they said was that they had various people talking about his options. And they talked about him having the sense to realize he needed to make compromises. But it finished by saying that they didn't think his chances of holding the young Taliban in check were great. I'd just like comments on that.
Samina, is that a dynamic that...
I actually don't really know what exactly he means by that, because one thing is what the Taliban are saying, but another thing is what the Taliban are actually doing on the ground. Because the last 2 years we've heard the Taliban, especially in Doha, saying many things, but in practice what we know is that, for example, they forbid music the last couple of weeks. They've been very unclear about women's access to education. We haven't seen a picture of a woman in their large gathering that has to do around the forming of their new government. So I wouldn't trust the Taliban unless I see what they do on the ground.
Eldridge, what do you make of the Taliban? Is this a single disciplined movement that can announce a policy or a system of government from the centre and be certain that it will be adhered to all the way down and throughout the country?
Well, I don't think there's any organization that can do that in the world. So I don't think we should expect that from the Taliban either. I think it's maybe asking too much. But I will say that they have a central body that is much more cohesive than we thought. They are actually a lot more cohesive than we thought. There may be, of course, a gap between them and the commanders on the ground and the normal mujahideen. That's going to have to be negotiated. And remember, they were fighting a war, so of course they focused on making things extreme, focused on getting the mujahideen to fight. Now, they need to reel them in if they're going to have any sort of government, even for themselves, even if they want to govern it the way they want to. They still need to have some sort of order around the principles that they want. And so they're going to need to reel that in. So there's definitely some sort of gap there. There's not going to... but this is to be expected in any sort of movement or guerrilla fight.
I think there's also tribal things between the Eastern and the Western Taliban. And I've been reading reports of detailed analysis of how this has been playing out. And there are divisions which have been opening up gradually between some of the more hardline commanders like the Haqqani network, who have been pressing for war, and other leaders who over the last 2 or 3 years have been pressing for Doha and to go the peaceful route. And these tensions have exacerbated in the last 2-3 weeks. And there is a huge question on how far the Doha political crew, the Quetta Shura, and the commanders east and west on the ground are going to cohere. The reality is that although Afghanistan has been a country with roughly the same borders now for 200 years, there have been very few periods when there have been strong centralized control for tribal reasons, for geographical reasons, for reasons of ethnicity and language, and religious differences. And more often than not, it's been a very, very loose confederation of local leaders and tribes, paying sometimes allegiance and loyalty, but not direct obedience to the centralized regime. And one of the interesting things that happened after the first Afghan war was that bizarrely it brought Afghanistan together because it was the whole country united against the British. This time, there are indications that it could lead to a splintering and to a fracturing of what has been a fairly coherent union for 20 years.
Let's get a question down.
But could I just...
I want to
okay.
get questions in the floor, if you don't mind, Eldridge.
No, please.
Yes.
Hello. I just wanted to say that often in situations like this, we have an increase in Arabophobia and Islamophobia in the West. I mean, just looking in our past history, specifically in America, but 9/11, the War on Terror, literal propaganda for misconceptions regarding the Islam religion and Arab culture. So my question is, what can we do to make sure that these misconceptions aren't spread across so that Afghan refugees who come to the West seeking refuge are welcomed and not bombarded by these misconceptions of a peaceful religion that is in no way connected to the Taliban or ISIS, as well as Afghan culture?
Samina.
I think that's a very, very beautiful question and reflection, because I think one of the main things that Afghan lost the last 20 years, especially young people, is their dignity. I even had friends in Afghanistan telling me that they're so ashamed for carrying an Afghan passport every time they go to the airport, because the assumption even before this crisis hit was that if you are an Afghan with an Afghan passport, you're not going to be granted visa anywhere in the world. So I think as a first step, we need to talk about these things, because Afghans, they do belong to the human family. And as a historian, you know all the great things Afghans have done for the history of humanity. Because in the 14th century, Afghanistan was the hub of art and culture, and also the Islamic civilization. And there's little evidence left of that today, but unfortunately a lot has been damaged because of the war. So we have to educate ourselves. We have to educate ourselves on Afghanistan all over again, but also looking at the situation from a lens of not just miserableism and victimhood, but also as a member of our family.
When Babur went to Delhi from Kabul, this is not necessarily a statement of what reality was, but certainly of his perceptions, was he was going from a hub of cosmopolitan high culture with an incredible tradition of painting and arts and architecture to somewhere that he regarded, perhaps wrongly, but nonetheless he had this impression, somewhere that was far less developed, far less civilized, with fewer universities, fewer gardens, fewer fine buildings, and fewer artists.
We've got a question up here.
I'm from Kabul, and I strongly believe that the international community should not accept Taliban rule in Afghanistan because they are a threat to Afghans' human rights and international security. So what can you do about it?
Thank you for your question. Samina, is it inevitable that the international community will have to accept and recognize as somehow legitimate the Taliban?
I mean, I agree with you, and not rushing to legitimize the Taliban. We shouldn't do that. but we also shouldn't forget the people that we have left behind. And that's why we need dialogue. We need to have a conversation. Otherwise, we will lose absolutely everything. And right now, like Eldridge was saying, we still have people that are willing to compromise in order to not lose absolutely everything. Because Afghanistan cannot go back to the 90s. The people of Afghanistan are not the same people as the 90s. And right now we're lucky because we have the world watching. We have a lot more access to Afghanistan through social media and also journalism. So we have to keep an eye on the Taliban. But I agree with you, we cannot legitimize the group yet.
Eldridge, what should the Western world, but the world in general, what approach should it take now to the Taliban?
Well, I think to Afghanistan in general, we have to be careful we don't take this wait-and-see approach, because that wait-and-see is going to make the whole thing fall. But at the same time, the EU has come up with explicit conditions, that certain conditions must be fulfilled with human rights, with regards to women, with regards to rule of law, a whole set of principles before any support can be provided to any government and anything that happens in Afghanistan. The Taliban also have to prove themselves. I mean, I think it's one thing to just say we've changed. We need to see this change. We need to understand this here, because otherwise, and this is a big problem, because again, they said we were talking in Doha, but actually they were pushing a different agenda and a military agenda to fight. So it's hard to trust in that sense, and I think it's going to be difficult for people in Afghanistan to trust. So I think the international community must be careful not to legitimize too quickly, but at the same time, be careful not to just take a wait-and-see approach, because by doing that, it will make things fall. But lastly, if it's okay, I can just come back to the point that Willie was on in terms of the ethnic composition and the breaking up of the Taliban. I think we have to be very careful, because we also assumed the Taliban was a loose organization, and they proved not to be. I can guarantee you that even in Doha, they were much, much cohesive than the Islamic Republic negotiating team. So let's be careful, because if we then think it's just going to fall apart, it's going to be a lot stronger than it was before. And we need to be careful what we're dealing with here.
Well, isn't there a danger that the West are simply going to be ignored in this and sidelined? The Taliban will form a relationship with the Chinese and the Russians.
The last words of Return of a King are next. It will be talking to two tribal elders, talking about the Americans, and they say the Americans are on their last days here. This is 10 years ago. The Americans are their last days. Next, it will be China. It's the last phrase of the book.
Yeah.
And we're talking here about the West or the international community as if it's a cohesive group, and we must not recognise the Taliban have been recognised by the Chinese government. The Taliban went on television last night to announce new deals with China, and China are next door.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't need us.
Very briefly, because we've got to wind up.
Yeah, and just on that point, if at some point, if we just ignore the Taliban as well, at some point they will also say, well, there's no point in communicating with these people, let's turn elsewhere.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to...
Okay, I wanted to take another question. I'm sorry, sir, I'm being told now we have to wind up. We started late and we've finished late, but thank you to all of you for engaging so well with this. And thank you to everybody here. Thank you very much.